Hello and welcome back to the Winning Agenda. My name's Jesse Muehlman-Marshall and I'm here today with the Iyslander Stormbind Hero Spotlight. This is the second of our Uprising Hero Spotlights. We had Dromai last week and today we're going to be taking a look at the hero. I was very excited about Dromai in one way, but I'm really excited about Iyslander because I think it's a hero that fits my playstyle very well. It's one I very much enjoy playing, and I've done a bit of a deep dive here on some of the cards that I think are worth paying attention to, and some of the ways to think about playing through this hero's mechanics. Once again, as I said in the last video, if you do want to support the channel and support our sponsors, thank you Underground Games. That's www.undergroundgamesbh.com.au. Link will be in the video description. If you use the code TWA5, you can get 5% off at Underground Games. And I think they've almost sold out of Uprising singles, so things are flying off the shelves. I'm sure Rob will be doing a restock soon, but you've got to get in quick. So today, Iyslander Stormbind. So her hero ability, as we've talked about previously in the spoiler season video that I did, allows you to play a blue non-attack action card from your arsenal as though it was an instant. So while it says you can play blue non-attack action cards from your arsenal as though they were instants, what that really means is that once in each turn cycle you can do that, because at the moment you can only put one card in the arsenal if you're playing as Iyslander. She doesn't have a way to gain that second arsenal slot. And what that means is that you can effectively get an action point on your opponent's turn. So when you're thinking about designing an Iyslander deck, you want to design one that can ideally do something on your own turn using your action point, and then do something on your opponent's turn using your action point that you get as long as you have a blue card in your arsenal. But in order to unlock that second action point, you have to have a card left to arsenal at the end of your turn. So that means that your blocking decisions are slightly different. The way you evaluate your cards in terms of what they do on your turn is slightly different, because it's all important to get that blue color strip card into your arsenal to turn on your hero ability and to turn on your weapon, which we'll come to in a minute. So whenever you play an ice card during your opponent's turn, you also create a frostbite token under their control. So if that blue card, that blue non-attack action card that you put into your arsenal is an ice card, then when you play it on your opponent's turn, you also create a frostbite under their control. That is an important little piece of disruption, and it's something that is worth keeping in mind when you're evaluating which blue non-attacks you want to be putting into your arsenal, and also then taking a step back to the deck building process, which blue non-attack action cards you want to be putting into your deck. So Waning Moon is the new weapon, and as I said, I talked about this in the previous video when we talked about the spoilers, but I'll cover it again here briefly. So it's got a once per turn instant ability, it costs 2 resources, and it says deal 2 arcane damage to target hero. If it's not your turn, instead deal 3 arcane damage to them. So if we compare that to Aether Conduit, which is a previous wizard 2-handed weapon, that was an action that cost 2 as well, and it dealt 2 arcane damage. So Waning Moon is already significantly better than that because it's a once per turn instant rather than action. In addition, you can deal 3 arcane damage to them if it's not your turn. So if you use it on your opponent's turn, you've got this extra damage, like 50% more damage. It's quite a lot. The drawback is that you can only activate it if you've played a non-attack action card this turn, which means that if you want to do it on your turn, you can't just pitch a card to attack with your weapon, so to speak. You have to also have played a non-attack action, and on your opponent's turn, you can't use the more powerful 3 damage ability unless you've played a card on their turn. And the easiest way to play a non-attack action card on their turn is through your hero ability to play the blue non-attack action cards from Arsenal. Obviously, you've got Storm Striders that you can use once per game, and perhaps some other ways to play non-attack action cards in your opponent's turn, but the easiest and most consistent way to turn on Waning Moon is to use Icelander's hero ability itself. And I've got frostbite tokens there for those of you who aren't familiar. So they basically make one thing that your opponent does cost an additional resource. The next thing that they do after you give them the frostbite. So with Icelander's hero ability, you can actually give your opponent frostbite tokens by playing ice cards on their turn in between the steps that they're trying to take. So for example, if they play a non-attack action to buff their next attack, you can then play something to give them a frostbite, or in some cases multiple frostbites, as we'll come to in a minute, and that may then prevent them from even being able to play the follow-up attack action. So having that instant speed ability to respond between the steps that your opponent's trying to take on their turn is particularly powerful against heroes like Briar or FaB that are trying to chain together multiple things on their turn. Against heroes that just want to because the turn hero gets priority at the start of their turn first. So against a hero like perhaps a Guardian who wants to just play one big attack on their turn, Icelander's ability to disrupt is a little bit lessened. So some of the key things to think about, as I talked about with the hero ability there, is what are you going to put in your arsenal? And what I've got here is a few of the ice cards, some from the new set and some existing cards, that you want to get into your arsenal, not only because they're good blues, but because they also are going to give a frostbite when you play them because of the ice part of Icelander's ability. So the first new card is Cold Snap. This is very similar to Polar Blast, the existing card that we had from Tales of Aria, in that it's a 1-cost non-attack action. It's an ice action. It costs 2. It has Go Again. It says target hero may pay 1 resource. If they don't, freeze a card in their arsenal or an ally they control until the start of your next turn. A frozen object can't be played or activated. If Cold Snap is played from arsenal, draw a card. So much like Polar Blast, this draws a card to replace itself. So on your opponent's turn, you can pay 1, play this from your arsenal. You've got 2 resources floating, which you can use, for example, for your Waning Moon. You also draw a replacement card, which is very, very important because it gives you more resources, it gives you more cards to block with, more things to do on your next turn, and it basically lessens the cost of having this card in your arsenal. Because it's an ice card, it's going to give your opponent a frostbite as well. So this one and Polar Blast are both worth considering. Now, the ability on Polar Blast is basically irrelevant on your opponent's turn because they have to pay or your next attack gets Dominate. This instead is they have to pay, and if they don't, you freeze their arsenal or an ally they control. This is also not going to matter every time you play it, right? They're not always going to have an arsenal or an ally, but it is, I think, going to matter more often than Polar Blast, which is why I've got it here as probably the one that I would prefer to play. Although, just for the ice and the cantrip, or the ability to draw a card, it may be worth playing both. The next card is Frost Hex. So this is one of the new Icelander specializations. It's actually an aura. It's an affliction, so you play it and it attaches to your opponent and it comes in under their control. It says frostbites you control have, at the beginning of your end phase, this deals 1 arcane damage to you. And importantly, unlike most other auras we've seen in the game, this doesn't die. It doesn't have an expiry clause. It just stays on the board for the rest of the game unless your opponent finds a way to remove it. So we know that in the set there is a natural way to remove it in Thor, but Thor aside, there are very few ways in the game at the moment to remove an aura under your own control. So Frost Hex, it does cost 3, it's reasonably expensive, but if you put it into your arsenal, you play it out, if they've spent all their resources for the turn, when you do play it out, then they're going to take a damage from the frostbite because they're not going to be able to pay for it, and they're going to end their turn, the frostbite will die, and they'll take a damage. But you've also got the flexibility that on the turn you play it, you can give them a frostbite to disrupt them a little bit, which kind of can offset the rather expensive cost of this costing 3. But then, of course, the capacity that this gives you to build up a long game plan where you can grind them out and potentially set up multiple of these and then try and kill them with one big turn of frostbite tokens is incredibly attractive and incredibly powerful. So this one is a really good one to have in your deck and a very good one to get into the arsenal. Insidious Chill, similarly, is another aura. It's another ice action aura, but this one has an expiry clause in that it enters with 3 frost counters on it, and when it has no frost counters on it, you destroy it. Now, what these frost counters do is that whenever you ice fuse, you remove a frost counter from this, and if you do, target hero discards a card unless they pay 2. Again, it's quite expensive because it costs 3 to get into play. It doesn't block for 3, it blocks for 2, unlike Frost Hex, but I think Insidious Chill is one of the most powerful tempo engines that we've seen so far in the game. So 3 triggers is quite a lot of one card. 3 triggers of discard unless they pay 2 is really pretty strong. And if you can string that over the following 3 turns by putting, after you play the Insidious Chill, putting a fuse non-attack action, a fuse blue non-attack action in your arsenal, and then playing that out on your opponent's turn and the subsequent turns, then you're getting to play your fuse cards, which most of which, as we'll see in a moment, deal damage and progress your game plan. But along the way, you're also getting the disruption. So what this kind of does is it tacks on the disruption that you get from playing ice cards from Arsenal, and it puts them onto your slightly more powerful fuse cards, all of which aren't ice cards, so they won't give frostbites, but this gives them arguably a slightly more powerful disruptive ability to make your opponent discard unless they pay 2. So I really like Insidious Chill. I like what it does in terms of building up a sort of mid-range game plan and giving you some really strong disruptive tools in those middle turns of the game to try and turn things in your favor. Hypothermia is another one of the new ice cards in Uprising. It costs 0. It's an affliction again, just like Frost Hex, so it attaches to your opponent. And it says, attacks you control can't gain Go Again. This doesn't affect attacks that naturally have Go Again. At the beginning of your end phase, destroy Hypothermia. So Hypothermia, it costs 0, which is kind of an indication, unlike Insidious Chill and Frost Hex, it's not as powerful. But it does have the capacity to be a little bit disruptive. It does block for 2. It'd be amazing if it blocked for 3, because a 0 cost block 3 would be fantastic. But as a 0 cost block 2, it has some disruptive potential, particularly against decks like Briar that are trying to use their embodiments of lightning, or against decks like Fire, which both of their weapons, the new Draconic weapon Searing Emberblade, but also the existing Harmonized Kodachis, have the capacity to gain Go Again from their inherent abilities, but Hypothermia will stop them from doing so. So there are quite a few cards in Flesh and Blood that do gain conditional Go Again, things like Scar for a Scar, and this will shut those down, but it doesn't have as higher impact or as wider application as you might like. So Hypothermia is one that I think will be on the fringe of a lot of deck lists. Channel the Bleak Expanse, again, is another majestic, another ice card. It blocks for 2. This one costs 1. It has Go Again, and it says heroes can't reveal cards, search decks, or draw cards from effects. Now, the thing about Channel the Bleak Expanse is that it's symmetrical. So unlike Channel Lake Frigid, which only affects your opponent, or the other channels, which only are the beneficial channels from Tales of Aria, which only affect you, this one affects both heroes symmetrically. And shutting down the capacity for heroes to reveal cards means that nobody can fuse. And there is, I think, as you can see from Insidious Chill, a reasonably strong Icelander archetype that's going to develop that's going to rely on fusion. And so I think Channel of the Bleak Expanse, hosing fusion or shutting down fusion while it's in play, has the capacity to harm you as much as it helps you. And for that reason, I'm not sure that it will see a lot of play in Icelander specifically. It's undoubtedly a very powerful card. I think it has some applications, potentially in other ice decks, but Oldhim and Lexi, both of the other existing ice heroes in the classic constructed hero pool, do like to fuse and draw cards. So Lexi likes to fuse arrows and isn't, I don't think, going to voluntarily play Channel of the Bleak Expanse and shut down her ability to fuse. And Oldhim likes to draw cards from Crown of Seeds. So I can also see that Oldhim probably won't want to be playing Channel of the Bleak Expanse out onto the board too often. So this one is in a bit of a funny spot because of that symmetrical nature, and it remains to be seen whether it will find a place. Channel Lake Frigid, on the other hand, as I mentioned, is a one-sided ability. So it really strongly hoses your opponent. It says cards and activated abilities they play cost an additional resource. It costs 2, it has Go Again, it blocks for 3. And it's got that Channel Ice ability that we're all familiar with, where you need to be pitching cards with ice cards on your turn, because at the beginning of your end phase, if you can't put a number of ice cards equal to the number of flow counters on this on the bottom of your deck, then the channel goes away. Channel Lake Frigid has a slightly different play pattern in Icelander because you can play it from your arsenal. So it's incredibly powerful and incredibly disruptive because you can completely mess with your opponent's math of their turn and how many resources they have to do things. It also gives that incidental frostbite when you play it from arsenal on your opponent's turn. But one of the difficulties is if you do play it on your opponent's turn, it is a little bit more difficult to keep around because you're going to need to be pitching an ice card on your turn to keep it around afterwards. So you need to be pitching one card to pay to for the Channel Lake Frigid, having the Channel Lake Frigid in Arsenal to play out itself, and then you need to have another ice card and something else to pay for with the ice card on your turn in order to keep the Channel Lake Frigid around. So it's not impossible, and if you can manage to do it, it's an incredible amount of disruption. But the other element that I should mention is that you want to also have a card to Arsenal. So you need a card to pitch for this, you need this in your Arsenal, you need an ice card to pitch for the Channel Ice ability, something to do with those resources, and a card to put into your arsenal. So basically it requires you not to be blocking on the turn that you play out the Channel Lake Frigid, and that might be fine. You in exchange for taking a bit of damage and their turn being disrupted anyway because of the frostbite and the channel lake frigid, so the damage is likely to be a bit lower, you end up with an arsenal the following turn, a bit of damage probably on your turn from the spell that you play, and a channel lake frigid that stays in play for their turn again, which means that their next turn is likely to not be very impactful either. So you can prioritize keeping these alive and playing around them, but they do, I guess, present a little bit more of a tax to keep in play for 2 of your opponent's turns than otherwise might be the case. So the next ones are sort of some damage dealers. So what we saw in that last section were the ice arsenal cards that give you some kind of, I guess, utility ability rather than something that's directly dealing damage to your opponent. But what Uprising also delivers us is a suite of cards that we can play from Arsenal that are blue, that are ice, so they're going to give a frostbite token to our opponent when we play them, and they also just directly deal damage. So Frosting, Aether Hail, and Ice Bolt are a cycle effectively of 3 common cards, Frosting costing 0, Aether Hail costing 1, and Ice Bolt costing 2, all blocking for 3, and they have, if we go back, Frosting dealing 1 arcane damage, Aether Hail dealing 2, and Ice Bolt dealing 3. So as you escalate in cost, you also escalate slightly in damage. I think blue Frosting and blue Aether Hail are probably going to be staples in an Icelander deck, but the math on Ice Bolt makes it a little bit more difficult. Just costing 2 and Waning Moon's ability costing 2 means that if you are arsenaling this and playing it on your opponent's turn, it's often a whole extra card that you're having to pitch to pay for this and the Waning Moon, whereas Frosting and Aether Hail slot in nicely, allowing you to pay for them and pay for your Waning Moon, and in the case of Frosting, also have one left over for something like an Oasis Respite. So I think Frosting and Aether Hail will be very strong options for Icelander decks, and Ice Bolt might find its way in if there are enough tunics floating around or things like that. Arctic Incarceration is another very powerful card, I think, at both blue and red, that might see a bit of play in Icelander decks. So this one also costs 0, like Frosting, so it has that advantage that if you play it from Arsenal on your opponent's turn, you pay for your Waning Moon, you can still have one floating for something like an Oasis Respite, but also you can block with 2 cards from your hand, play out the Arctic Incarceration and give them a frostbite, or 2 frostbites, one from Icelander, one from the Incarceration itself, and you can then still have a card to Arsenal on your following turn, or any combination in between. So basically costing 0 means that you're not committed to pitching a card on your opponent's turn. You have the flexibility to either block or hold things back for your turn, or you can pitch into the Waning Moon and Oasis Respite or something else on their turn. So these 0 cost ice arsenals are very powerful, particularly where they have an impactful ability like Arctic Incarceration giving an extra frostbite, or Frosting getting in an extra point of damage. Amulet of Ice is another 0 cost ice non-attack action that you can play on their turn from Arsenal with Icelander's ability, give them a frostbite, and then bank this item in play for later use when you fuse. So you can team this up with some of the other cards, Frost Hex, to try and set up a really impactful turn in the late game where you can fuse one of the cards that we'll see coming up, Sigil of Permafrost, or even Icelander's other specialization, give them a whole bunch of frostbites on their turn and strip some cards from their hand at the same time using your Amulet of Ice and some of your other effects. So I do expect to see a few Amulet of Ices floating around, particularly in some matchups against, the slower decks, the Oldhams, and the decks that aren't putting as much pressure on you, but are instead demanding that you find a way to kill them. I think Amulet of Ice is going to be a key tool in allowing Icelander to get over the top of some of those defensive decks. So some of the on-hit arsenals. So I've talked a bit about the fusion abilities and the options that we have to have slightly more powerful plays from Arsenal that aren't ice cards, so aren't going to give us the frostbite necessarily inherent from Icelander's hero ability, but are going to potentially give us some more damage or some different effects. So Polar Cap's a great example. It does cost 2, which is a bit expensive. It's got Ice Fusion though, so it gives us any of our fuse triggers or when you fuse triggers are going to work. From Polar Cap, it blocks for 3, and it says deal 2 arcane damage to any target. If it was fused and deals damage to a hero, create a frostbite under their control. So Polycap kind of demands that they either commit some resources to Arcane Barrier, or they take a Frostbite and they have to commit some resources to getting rid of the Frostbite. So it's a really, if your objective is to tax your opponent's resources on their turn, arsenaling a Polycap is a great way to guarantee that that's going to happen. And similarly, Icebind, it's a 0 cost, so has all those advantages of the 0 cost blue arsenals that I talked about. But it can, if it was fused and it deals damage to them, freeze a card in their arsenal until the start of your next turn. So if they have an arsenal and they don't play it as their first play on their turn, you can pop out your Icebind. It either demands that they pay a resource to prevent the arcane damage, or they don't get to play their arsenal for the turn. And potentially, if you have something to follow up with, like a Succumb to Winter, then you're threatening to also kill their arsenal card. So this is a 1 damage play, a 0 cost play that is kind of demanding to be arcane barriered and, demanding a resource from them, as long as they have an arsenal. The other card is Aether Icevein. So this is a 3 cost card. It also has Ice Fusion. It says deal 3 arcane damage to any target. If either Icevein was fused and deals damage to a hero, they discard a card unless they pay 2 resources. So if we compare this to playing like an Ice Bolt, you're getting 3 damage, but it's costing you 1 more. But in return for that 1 more that you're paying to play this, you're demanding, if it hits, that they discard a card unless they pay 2. So they are faced again with the conundrum of, do I commit 3 resources to preventing the 3 damage from this, which is, a whole nother blue from my hand or potentially multiple cards. And if I don't do that, then I'm going to have to either lose a card or pay 2/3 of a blue anyway. And so it's a pretty strong disruptive threat, and it's one that doesn't give your opponent a lot of choices. Either way, they're having to commit some of the resources from their hand to either preventing the damage or dealing with the on-hit ability. So Succumb to Winter is the other 3 cost blue that I mentioned a moment ago. It's also got Ice Fusion, and it says deal 3 arcane damage to any target. If it was fused and targets a hero, destroy a frozen card in their arsenal. If it was fused and targets a frozen ally, destroy that ally. So if you can find a way on your turn to freeze an opponent's arsenal or freeze one of their allies, you can just straight up kill that arsenal or that ally as a additional benefit, regardless of whether this deals damage. So unlike the others, which all require you to deal damage in order for their ability to trigger, Succumb to Winter happens when you play it. So as long as you target the hero or you target the ally, you get the destruction, which allows Icelander crucially to kill some of the bigger dragons. As we can see in the artwork, this is a way that Icelander can deal with Dromai's largest legendary dragons, some of which have HP or toughness that's above a range that Icelander can easily deal with. Or even Uvia, which is a very strong threat against Icelander because it's putting out an Arcane Barrier 1 either Ashwing every single turn. Succumb to Winter gives Icelander a way to effectively deal with that, or to just get this incidental benefit of killing an Arsenal card against any other hero, in addition to getting the 3 damage. So some of these cards here are the ones that I mentioned a bit earlier around Frost Hex. It's got this incredible long game ability to build up and build up and build up, and threaten that if your opponent ever ends their turn with a Frostbite token, they're going to be taking 1 damage per Frost Hex for each Frostbite token that they end their turn with. So who's this strongest against? And I think counterintuitively, the Frost Hex plan is actually strongest against decks that have higher cost effects in their deck. So Guardian decks and others, which, although they have a lot of blues, the abilities that they're spending their resources on tend to also be more expensive. So, and because their game plan is not going to effectively be to strip cards from your hand as often, they're going to be using a lot of their resources to Arcane Barrier your damage, and try and prevent everything that you're doing and, deck you out or fatigue you. Frost Hex is a way that you can threaten them with a little bit more damage if they, say, prevent the damage side of what you're doing, but then ignore your frostbites on their turn. Try to just arcane barrier everything and just pass turn without having done anything, so then the frostbites expire. Instead, the frost hex says, no, you can't do that. You actually have to proactively do something on your turn as well as preventing my damage on my turn and my damage that I'm doing on your turn from my arsenal and from my Waning Moon. So I think frost hex is a really important way of presenting a third phase to the threat to those control decks, particularly those control guardian decks. And what are some of the ways that you can do that? I mean, these work not just in that particular matchup, but as a game plan that you can try and build towards in other matchups as well. So Isenhowl Weathervane is a way that you can get, as we can see, multiple frostbites on your opponent. So the red version says it's a 1-cost ice action. It has go again. And it says the next time you ice fuse this turn, create 4 frostbite tokens under target hero's control. Now, if we consider the blue one instead, it creates 2 frostbite heroes the next, 2 frostbite tokens the next time you ice fuse. And so that one is playable from Arsenal, this one's not. So the red one is a play on your turn and then play an ice fuse spell or non-attack action on your turn. That's the plan. The blue one is more flexible, you can do it on your turn, but you can also do it as a play from Arsenal, give them a frostbite when you play it, and then if you've got some other way to ice fuse on their turn, you can do it that way, whether it's a Sigil of Permafrost or something else. So Isenhowl Weathervane, the blue, is a little bit hard to make work unless you have something like Sigil of Permafrost, because it's harder to ice fuse from something else, from a different effect, if your arsenal is taken up by that blue Isenhowl Weathervane. Because really Sigil of Permafrost is probably the only one that, because you can't play one of the other blue non-attack actions with Ice Fusion because the Isenhowl Weathervane was in your arsenal. So I think the red one on your turn is probably the way to go, planning to play around that. You know, pitch a blue, play Isenhowl Weathervane, and then play one of the 0 or 2 cost Ice Fusion attacks. It obviously doesn't work on either Icevein or Succumb to Winter so easily because they cost 3, but if you've got a Tunic resource up, for example, to pay for the Weathervane, and you can pitch a blue to play your Succumb to Winter or your either Icevein on your turn, then that obviously works as well. And I think those turns are going to be pretty powerful. Like if you do spend a Tunic resource to play Isenhowl Weathervane, red, and then pitch a blue, play an either Icevein fusing with an ice blue from your hand, say, you're threatening 5 damage from a red either Icevein, an on-hit ability that they discard unless they pay 2. You're creating 4 frostbites under their control just for fusing, and then you've still got your arsenal and your play on their turn. So I think this could be a very, very strong control piece. It's reasonably inexpensive in that it only costs 1 and it has go again. And it just demands that you put a critical mass, I guess, of Ice Fusion cards into your deck, of which we've got quite a few in this new set, all of which are very good. Ice Eternal is one of these aforementioned Ice Fusion cards. It has the famous Sonata Arcanix cost of XX. No ways yet to reduce this cost significantly. I mean, we do have Sonic Boom, I guess, so you could look at some kind of massive Sonic Boom combo into Ice Eternal. I'll leave that to the brainiacs out there, but this is an Icelander specialization. It's blue, it costs XX and it defends for 3. It's got Ice Fusion and it says create X Frostbite tokens under target hero's control. Then if Ice Eternal was fused, deal arcane damage to that hero equal to the number of frostbites they control. So if you pitch a blue, and this is in your arsenal, you pay 2 resources, X equals 1. You create 1 frostbite under their control, then you deal arcane damage to them equal to the number of frostbites they control. So basically for 2 resources, you create a frostbite and you deal a damage. For 4 resources, you create 2 frostbites, deal 2 damage. And for 6 resources, you create 3 frostbites, deal 3 damage. But obviously this is an amazing follow-up to that Isenhowl Weathervane plan. You know, if you play the Isenhowl Weathervane, play the Aether Icevein on your turn, they elect to block all the damage on your turn, and just sit there with the 4 frostbites thinking, I'll just get through this turn cycle. You know, they've used their Tunic counter, they've used some of their good cards, they had a good hand. I'll just let those 4 frostbites expire and come back at them next turn. If you follow that up then with an Ice Eternal, say for 4 resources, X equals 2, they've then got 6 frostbites and they're taking 6 damage. And all you've spent is the Ice Eternal and 4 resources. And then, you know, you can follow that up with a Waning Moon with your 2 floating, and you've dealt a total of like 9 damage on their turn, and they've just attempted to pass. And then if you've got a Frost Hex in play, they might take another 6 damage from the 6 frostbites they can't pay for. If you've got 2 frost hexes in play, maybe they're taking 12. So you can see very quickly how this can stack with the game plan of Frost Hex and Isenhowl Weathervane into quite a lot of damage in a relatively inexpensive way that also denies your opponent the capacity to play on their turn. So they have to respect both the threat that you're putting out in the first place in the Aether Icevein, but then also these other threats that the frostbites and the frost associated cards are going to present them. So Sigil of Permafrost is the other one I've mentioned a couple of times. So this is a defense reaction with Ice Fusion. So you can potentially follow up a blue Isenhowl Weathervane from Arsenal with this, but I don't think that's where we want to be kind of building around that, although maybe. But it's a 1-for-4 defense reaction with Ice Fusion, and if it was fused, the next time you deal arcane damage to a hero this turn, create that many frostbites under their control. So if you manage to combine this with an Ice Eternal, you can also be creating additional frostbites. It does have to be defending something, so it's probably not going to work in that same grand plan with the red Isenhowl Weathervane I talked about before, because if they can afford to attack you with something, then they've already cracked the Isenhowl Weathervane frostbites. But it is a way to stack up some additional frostbites before the end of turn that they may not be able to clear, and that will then pop and deal them damage from Frost Hex. So Sigil of Permafrost in this package is another way that you can present a damage threat to your opponent from your frostbites. So Blizzard is a card from Aria that we're all reasonably familiar with. And I just wanted to touch on the fact that it's an instant, so it's another ice card you can play on your opponent's turn. It creates a frostbite when you play it, and it also disrupts their turn and makes it harder for them to go again. So against those, the Briars, the Fires, the other decks that are trying to go wide, or even Prism, it can pretty much shut down their turn and give you an extra frostbite, which plays well into this game plan. So some of the impactful reds, I talked about Aether Icevein, which we showed the blue version of earlier. Obviously at red, it's dealing 5. But you've got a couple of other Majestics in the set, which are both red, and they're both damage dealers. And I just wanted to touch on them briefly as well. So Freezing Point, it does cost 3, but it has Ice Fusion, and it says deal 5 arcane damage to target hero. If Freezing Point was fused, instead deal X arcane damage to target hero, where X is 5 plus the number of Frostbites, Ice Afflictions, and Frozen cards they control. So this counts Frostbites. So think about that previous plan. If you can do the Isenhowl Weathervane thing, do the Ice Eternal thing, have a Frost Hex on them, or even 2, ideally, and then on their turn, pitch 1 to your Stormstriders, or use your Tunic for your Stormstriders, and then Freezing Point them at a crucial point in the turn when they're sitting there with quite a few Frostbites and these Frost Hexes. Freezing Point can suddenly deal 5 plus 2 for your Frost Hexes plus 4 for your Frostbites. It's at 7, 11 damage for 3 resources. So all of a sudden you're getting up to a really, really big burst of damage that is very efficient for the cost. So Freezing Point is one that I think we're going to see a lot of people playing off Stormstriders as a finisher in Icelander, and it just works so well and synergizes so well with some of those other cards. Encase is a 0 cost. It's also got Ice Fusion, it blocks for 3. It says deal 3 arcane damage to any target, so 0 for 3. That's pretty much standard rate for these arcane damage spells. If Encase was fused and deals damage to a hero, freeze the hero and all equipment they control until the start of your next turn. A frozen object can't be played or activated. So that means that they can't take a resource off their Tunic, they can't make a rune chant with their Grasp of the Arknight, they can't activate their Fire to get back their Phoenix Flame from the graveyard. All of these things are potentially quite disruptive. They range from, a mild inconvenience to being incredibly disruptive and potentially saving you from a lot of damage in the case of, a Phoenix Flame at the right time, triggering a Mask of Momentum and something else. If you can stop that all from happening by freezing their Fire and stopping them getting back that Phoenix Flame, then Encase can do quite a little bit more than just the 0 for 3 damage. So I think at a baseline level, Encase is exactly on par with the commons that do the same thing, but it's got this additional fusion ability that can be worth quite a bit in addition to that. So definitely worth playing. Snapback is the other one that's worth considering. It's another way that you can deal arcane damage on your opponent's turn for things like your Sigil of Permafrost. It synergizes really well with Icelander because it's a way of getting additional arcane damage dealers on your opponent's turn when your blues that you're playing from Arsenal may not be that impactful or have that higher damage ratio. I think it's probably superseded by the wide range of stuff that Icelander's got available to her now in the new set, but it's just something to keep in mind anyway when you're deck building. So the other thing to mention about Icelander is that you do have the option to play attack action cards. So you're not restricted just to killing your opponent with arcane damage. You can look at bringing in some attack action cards to either finish them off or try and get through their defenses in a way that they don't expect. Because obviously your opponent's going to sit down, they're going to see you're playing Icelander, and they're going to have to select their equipment and their sideboard options accordingly, which means they might take out defense reactions, they might take out equipment that has physical block and replace it with arcane barrier equipment, and they might tool their game plan around preventing arcane damage. So if you can prevent a dual threat or even pivot to more of your damage coming from physical attacks or construct your deck that way, you might be able to have the element of surprise and potentially deal with an opponent who's not as well equipped to deal with what you're presenting. So some of the hybrid options that synergize well with Icelander is your 6 base power attack action cards that are going to pop Phantasms. Erase Face is one from the new set. It deals well with opposing fusion. It stops them from fusing because all the cards they control lose class and talent types until the end of their next turn. It's a good way of dealing with illusionist attacks, so things like Prism, Luminaris giving all illusionist attacks go again. All of a sudden their attacks don't have illusionist because they lose their class, and so they won't gain go again from Luminaris. So there are lots of applications for Erase Face's on-hit ability, but it is a 2 for 6 that doesn't have go again. It does only block for 2, and it isn't always going to fit in. But this is certainly one that's going to be in the mix, depending on your metagame and how your game plan evolves, that you might want to consider against some decks. Cadaverous Contraband is another one that synergizes really well with Wizards. We have seen some Kano decks playing this across the journey, because obviously the on-hit ability of being able to put any non-attack action card from your graveyard back on top of your deck can work out really well. It gives you some card selection and the ability to recur some of your more important threats, whether it's a Channel Lake Frigid or for disruption, or an Encase or a freezing point to try and finish your opponent off. Cadaverous Contraband does give you that option, and it's a threat that presents 6 damage and is probably going to demand 2 cards from their hand, or else you get to have some really crucial card selection at a key point in the game. Rifting is one that we haven't actually seen get a lot of play, but if it hits, you can play your next non-attack action card this turn as though it was an instant. So this is a way that Icelander can more easily play a double spell turn on your turn if you want to. This isn't the direction that I'm going to go straight away in terms of developing my Icelander decks, but it is a reasonably free ability in the sense that you've got a 2 for 6 anyway. You do need to, the cost to it is that you do need to hold the additional card to your turn, but again, that is something that you're going to want to be doing in Icelander anyway, because you're going to want to be holding a blue to Arsenal. I guess the difficulty with this though is that if your opponent just takes the damage, you're not always then going to want to play that last card because your Arsenal is just so valuable to you. So your opponent might just call your bluff if you've only got 1 card left in hand after you play the Rifting. And they might just say, I'll take the damage because I know that you're not going to play that extra card anyway because you're going to want to Arsenal it. All that being said, I just thought I'd put it on here because it does have some synergies and some theoretical application in Icelander, but I think those drawbacks will probably hold it back from being played. Exude Confidence is a much more sort of powerful card and does synergize really nicely with Icelander, and I think will be a good sideboard option against those more defensive decks that might be just sort of chock full of defense reactions. So an Oldhim deck that can't even cut all its defense reactions, so they will still have some in their deck. Exude Confidence is just another way, particularly once you get them lower in life, hopefully, to present a lethal threat and hopefully force them to overblock. It does have the ability obviously to get pumped by blues. So if you do want to put some extra blues into it and you have got them on the back foot, you can get a bit of damage in here and there, even if it's not lethal. But yeah, it's also, I guess, a 0 cost threat that can attack Prism Auras and do other things that the deck doesn't necessarily do too well. So it does have a bit of versatility in some other matchups as well, because you don't have a weapon that can attack Spectra Auras, and you don't have any other attack action cards that can go into Spectras. So you might want to bring in some 1-card Spectra Poppers into your deck to allow you to deal with those pesky Genesis and other things that hit the board. Heart of Findle is another one. It's not necessarily a hybrid option, but it's just something that's worth talking about because I think it does fit really well into Icelander. You don't have the downside that Kano has from playing Heart of Findle of having a brick on top of your deck in terms of Kano's ability. Icelander doesn't really mind. She's going to be pitching a blue most of the time, and she doesn't really care if it's not in her hand, if it's on top of her deck. And the upside of being able to gain life, I think, is very important for Icelander, who starts behind and can make a big difference to the outcome of the game. Command and Conquer, of course, is the other one. CNC stocks have dropped a little bit recently. We've got Crown of Providence, we've got Crown of Seeds, and more ways for people to get things out of their arsenal, as well as Icelander herself, of course, against whom Command and Conquer is not particularly strong. So I don't know that we're going to see a lot of CNCs in Icelander decks, but it is still an option depending on whether decks that do value the arsenal like Briar turn out to be strong in the metagame. So some of the sideboard options that we've got, Rewind against decks that have non-attack actions that cost resources. So it can be good, particularly against Brute. If Rhinar becomes big, it's pretty brutal to rewind someone's Bloodrush Bellow. But also rewinding a Channel Mount Heroic is pretty strong. Although good Briar players will know that Channel Mount Heroic might not be where it's at against Icelander with all the taxes. It does make Channel Mount Heroic a bit less powerful. But Rewind's there as an option anyway, and it's something that might get stronger into the future. Oasis Respite is, I think, a very strong card. So it's like effectively a 1 for 5. It's a 1-card 5. And if you have it on a turn when you've got a 0 in your arsenal, as I mentioned earlier, a Frosting or something else that you can play for 0, Frosting or Icebind or any of those 0s, you play the 0 from your arsenal, you attack with Waning Moon for 2, and then you've got 1 left over, which I think Oasis Respite is probably one of the most powerful plays you can make with that 1 floating resource. It's going to prevent 4 damage from an incoming attack and potentially gain you a life as well if you're lower on life. So I do expect to see Oasis Respite getting quite a bit of play in Icelander. Fate Foreseen and the other 0 for 4 defense reactions, also all very playable, but I do think that Sigil of Permafrost is probably going to get slotted in first ahead of Fate Foreseen and sink below. And then, of course, Singe, as if either Ashwings and Dromai do turn out to be very strong, and of course either Ashwings are probably at their strongest against Icelander and Wizards because of the Arcane Barrier ability, then Singe might be something that we see in some sideboards popping up to help clear out a few of those Ashwings. Scour is one that can help us to deal with obviously 0 cost aura tokens and 0 cost auras, so it can help with, if Prism is very popular, clearing out those spectral shields. Obviously with no rune chance from Viserai, or not as many rune chance, with both Viserai and Chain being a little bit weaker, Chain being gone, Viserai being a little bit weaker in the meta, Scour doesn't quite have as many applications, but I still think clearing out those pesky spectral shields and dealing some arcane damage along the way could be a strong play, so Scour might see some play in some sideboards. Amulet of Echoes is another one that's worth mentioning. It's a blue, it's got Go Again, and it does have the capacity to make a 5-player discard 2 cards if they've played 2 Phoenix Flames. So it kind of turns off things like Phoenix Form a little bit. Obviously, they can sequence, once this is on the board, they can sequence things in such a way that they get around the ability by playing their Phoenix Flame as their last chain link, but that still does potentially prevent some of their Rupture finishes and things like Phoenix Form as other finishes from being viable on turns where there are multiple Phoenix Flames being played. So I could see Amulet of Echoes being a sideboard option for Icelander if FaB does turn out to be a big part of the new Classic Constructed meta. Some other options I'll go through quickly. I know the video is getting very long, but I just had lots of thoughts. I had lots of things to say about Icelander, so I want to get them all down. So I'll cruise through these. Energy Potion is obviously always there as a solid option if you are going for more of an OTK style build. Sigil of Permafrost, another 1-cost defense reaction that can pretty easily be a 1-for-4 if that's what you're after. A 1-for-4 blue, very importantly. If you're worried about your blue ratios, most 1-for-4s are going to be red if they've got a beneficial ability. But Sigil of Permafrost in Icelander is pretty regularly a 1-for-4 blue to play from hand, in addition to a blue non-attack action from Arsenal. Pummel is another option if you're going more of the hybrid, more of the physical route. Pummel is something that you can work into those powerful on-hit abilities. Emeritus Scalding is a strong blue if you're eschewing some of the ice stuff and you're not worrying about giving too many frostbites and you're just focusing on arcane damage. Emeritus Scalding is an efficient blue, dealing 4 on their turn if you play it from Arsenal. Aether Wildfire similarly, if you're going for some kind of combo kill, slotting in 1 or even multiple Aether Wildfires might be the way to go to help amplify the power of that combo. Talisman of Balance is one that if you can get it out early, like even if you can get it out on turn 1, it's amazing. But it basically guarantees that you're going to get an Arsenal the first time that you would end your turn without an Arsenal, as long as they have one. Now, that's obviously not a guarantee because they might not have one. And they might elect not to Arsenal once you have your Talisman of Balance out and still deny the Arsenal, but it's worth thinking about given how important the Arsenal is to Icelander. If you are in a matchup where you think you might have to be blocking a bit more, then this potentially gives you the flexibility to do that in a way that you're still going to get an Arsenal on your next turn. So even if you block out with your whole hand, if you're confident that they're going to end up with an Arsenal, which is not always easy to judge, but if you are, then you might be able to move to your next turn and end the turn and still get your Arsenal. A lot of ifs in there. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to mention it. Caution similarly has a few applications in Icelander. It is playable, obviously. She's an elemental hero. It costs 1, which is a nice amount. Turns on Waning Moon, gets you going. It does require you to gain resources, gain life, or have something gain defense or attack power in order for it to stay around. You've obviously got, Exude Confidence is something that can gain attack power. You've got Sigil of Permafrost as something that can gain defensive power. You've got all the reveals that are going to come from all your fusion, which you can do on your turn and on your opponent's turn to trigger Caution. So basically anything that involves pitching 1 for Caution, playing a 0-cost fuser, or taking a resource from Tunic, which is actually gaining a resource because of how it's worded, or pitching Heart of Findle afterwards. Any of those things on your turn, playing a 0-cost fuser being the primary one, is going to keep Caution around. And then as long as you've got an Arsenal that is either a fuser or something else that will gain you life on their turn, like even an Oasis Respite, then you can keep your Caution around. So it remains to be seen whether there are quite enough ways that are very playable to keep Caution around proactively on both your turn and their turn. But I think we're kind of getting to the point with the number of Ice Fusion cards that are playable here that you're going to be revealing often enough on both your turn and your opponent's turn potentially to keep Caution around at least for a little while and get a bit of a benefit from it. So I'm certainly going to be testing it out and see how it goes. The equipment suite. Arcanite Skullcap, also another way to get plus defense on both your and your opponent's turn, depending on how the life total changes go, to keep Caution around, but all in all, just a powerful piece of equipment. Coronet Peak is a very strong, I think, new piece of ice equipment. It means that on your turn, you do have something else to spend your resources on. So the issue that I mentioned before, sometimes with keeping Channel Lake Frigid around, where you don't have something to pitch an ice card to do, in addition to keeping a card to Arsenal, now means that you can set up your Channel Lake Frigid turns with Coronet Peak, where you pitch 1 card to play out the Frigid, block with the second card, use the third card, which is an ice card, to activate Coronet Peak on your turn, and then still have the 4th card left to Arsenal. So I think Coronet Peak does have some applications, and certainly just being a 2-block headpiece is pretty powerful. Olivian Constellus is the other playable legendary. It synergizes very well with Waning Moon, giving you free Waning Moon activations. So in any kind of mirror match against a wizard, against Kano or Icelander, or against Briar, who might be sending some Rosetta Thorn swings or Rune Chants your way, I think Alluvion Constellus is worth considering as a chess piece and something that's going to give you a little bit of value over the course of the game and potentially let you get in a couple of extra Waning Moon swings. Final Spring Tunic, similarly, you've got so many ones and so many things that are going to take you just over that kind of resource breakpoint of 3, like combinations of things that are going to get you to 4 or to 7, and Tunic just has so much application in this deck. It's also a deck that's going to take the game longer, making Tunic even more powerful. So definitely worth thinking about playing Tunic. And then Heart of Ice, of course, is the other Arcane Barrier option. It's one that might be one that you consider against Kano or against some other wizards, depending on what you're expecting. But Alluvion Constellus is also worth thinking about. So I think those are 2 things we're going to be thinking about and trading off. Metacarpus Node, still a powerful arm piece. It's a deck that's going to have potentially those extra resources on the turn that it's going off and the turn that it's trying to kill. And so it also works on Ice Eternal. It's worth noting that if you do go for that kind of ice combo where you're trying to combo an Ice Eternal with a freezing point, the Ice Eternal does have an effect that deals arcane damage, so this will amplify it, as does, of course, the freezing point. So Metacarpus Node has a few applications there. Conduit of Frostburn is another playable piece of ice arm equipment. It does allow you to threaten to destroy frozen cards in Arsenal. So if you're going for more of a kind of freezing strategy, if you've got enough cards in your deck that are attempting to freeze, then Conduit of Frostburn, particularly against a redliner deck, could be something that's pretty powerful. If you can make use of the Quell and kill their Arsenal on the same turn, then that's of course going to be a very, very powerful piece of equipment. Stormstriders, I think, is going to be the mainstay of most Icelander decks, just as it has been for Kano decks since it was released. So that brings us to the end of the Icelander Hero Spotlight. So I was racing through things a little bit there towards the end. I hope you enjoyed. I'm super excited, I don't know if you could tell, about this hero. I'm going to post my current, just sort of very level 1 deck list of Icelander based on all the things we've discussed here. And I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear those of you who are doing some playtesting or going out to your local tournaments, whether it's Road to Nationals or Armories, and giving Icelander a go. Let me know how it turns out. If you do want to join the channel to support the channel, it's $3 a month Australian. I think that's about $2 US a month. It helps to support the channel, pay for the content that we produce, and also it'll give you access to our first of the month draws for the content creator promos and lots of other giveaways. So thanks for watching, thanks for your support, and we'll see you for the Fire Hero Spotlight very soon. Cheers.